Hello, everyone. Welcome to our participants and to our speakers today. This session of the Berlin Climate and Security Conference is a bit special. We'd like to welcome you to this live recording of the Climate Diplomacy podcasts. We are your hosts, Raquel Manayat and Hannah Kornot. You may know our voices by now if you listen to our podcast, and we're delighted to be here with you in this different format today. The Climate Diplomacy Podcast is a series which features leading experts offering their take on what needs to be done to promote climate foreign policy and provide you with context you need to understand climate diplomacy today. If you need more information on the podcast, you can always visit our website, climate-diplomacy.org, or also follow us on Twitter under Climate Diplo. Around the world, climate change interacts with social, political, economic, and environmental drivers of conflict and fragility, thereby challenging the stability of states and societies and undermining international security. We are joined by three experts from three different regions today to hear examples of locally informed solutions and explore climate security around the world.
In Southern Africa, climate change is a central threat to livelihood security and well-being. Food insecurity, forced migration, and stressed resources have emerged as human security issues, while more extreme weather events and increasing temperatures are undermining economic growth, health, productivity, livelihoods, and employment, and thus national and regional stability. We are joined by Ottilia Anna Maunganitze, author of the upcoming Climate Fragility Risk Brief on Southern Africa and head of Special Project, Office of the Executive Director at the Institute of Security Studies. Welcome, Ottilia.
Thanks a lot for having me.
And now we move up to the Arctic, where climate change is happening 3 times faster than the global rate. These changes present considerable risks. The region faces several climate change-related tipping points, as well as geopolitical and militarization threats, all of which have major ramifications, both for Indigenous communities and the international community at large. We've already recorded an episode with her, and we're very happy to welcome her again, Marisol Maddox, author of the recent Climate Fragility Risk Brief on the Arctic region and Arctic analyst at the Polar Institute of the Woodrow Wilson International Center. Hello, Marisol.
Hi, great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
And moving back to the African continent, in the Horn of Africa, climate change exacerbates existing conflict and fragility dynamics. Climate change negatively impacts the availability of natural resources, and this can contribute to conflict by worsening livelihood conditions, increasing migration, or changing pastoral mobility patterns. Sagal Abshir is with us today to tell us more about this. She is the author of the Climate Fragility Risk Brief about the Horn of Africa and a lawyer, writer, and researcher with 20 years of experience. Hi, Sagal. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Hannah. Thanks for having me here today.
We have 40 minutes to discuss a few questions, and afterwards around 10 minutes where we open the floor for questions from the audience. And with no further ado, I think we just dive right into the topic. And since the session is called Climate Security Around the World, let's start with a tour de table. Could you please give our audience an impression about the regions you wrote about? So what is the climate context, and why is climate security in your region a topic that we need to talk about today? Sagal, would you like to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I'll be talking about the Greater Horn of Africa. And that's a region that's officially made up of the 8 countries of the IGAD organization. And those are quickly Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Uganda. Within these countries, you have Sudan, which is one of Africa's largest countries, and you have Djibouti, which is one of its smallest. You have Ethiopia, which is the oldest, and you have South Sudan, which is the very youngest country, coming into existence in 2011. So we can definitely say it's a diverse region, ethnicity, language, history, politics, and economic development. The Greater Horn is a massive area, about 5.2 million square kilometers with 230 million people. And to put that into context, that's a little bit bigger than the EU, with about half the population. It's a very dry area. About 3/4 of the region gets less than 6 centimeters of rainfall a year. And 80% of the population is employed in farming or herding and very much dependent on that rain. The region has experienced a series of devastating famines over the last 50 years, all of them occurring at the nexus of drought and war. We had Ethiopia in the 80s, Somalia in the 90s, Darfur in the 2000s, Somalia again in 2011, and sadly, the prospect of another famine looms in Ethiopia with the recent conflict going on. And so in the past 50 years, according to the IPCC, we've definitely seen this region heat up and have a lot less rain. And the projections look like it's going to get even hotter, with the rains being both drier and heavier. Like, how can that be possible? But basically, we're going to have a lot more rainfall with the short rains, with a lot of long dry spells and a lot less rain in the long rain season, which is the rains that most of the region's crops rely on. And all studies point to more frequent droughts and storms. So poverty, food security, land degradation, climate change is exacerbating all of these pressures in the region, despite the fact that the countries of the Horn have little to no control over global carbon emissions. And of course, climate change is interacting with conflict dynamics, but I think we're going to be talking about that a little later.
Yeah, we will definitely. Looking forward already. And Marisol, next over to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'll be talking about the Arctic region, which makes up 8 countries. So it's Canada, Denmark because of Greenland, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Russia, and the United States. And what we're seeing is that the changes in the Arctic have an absolutely immense impact, not only domestically for those countries, but also for the rest of the world. Because of a phenomenon known as Arctic amplification, the region is experiencing climate change around 3 times faster than the global rate of change. And the changes that are occurring have profound implications. So there's 4 million people that live in the Arctic. 500,000 of those are indigenous. And a lot of the coastal communities are really at the front lines of that immediate change. But then there's also really serious global implications. And so there's a few global climate tipping points that are directly linked to changes in the Arctic. So some of those include stability of the Greenland ice sheet, stability of permafrost, and also the AMOC, which is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, which is a fancy way of saying it's basically this giant ocean conveyor belt that includes the Gulf Stream. And so what we're concerned about, one of the many things we're concerned about, are some of these potential for tipping points, which are, an abrupt change in the state of a system where it's not clear how much it's possible to overshoot the thresholds of those tipping points and for how long before the changes are irreversible. And there's also the risk that triggering one tipping point could actually lead to other tipping points being triggered in a domino effect. Some say that the fate of the Arctic is the fate of Miami. And I think that that's a really good way of understanding that the changes we're seeing in the Arctic don't just matter for the region, but for the rest of the world, and especially for low-lying communities around the world. And this is really demonstrative of the fact that the way I like to think of it is that actorless threats are increasingly going to be influencing global stability, including the ways that state and non-state actors respond to them.
Thanks so much, Marisol. I think we'll get back to 1 or 2 or 3 of these points later on. Now over to you, Tilja.
Thanks a lot, Hannah. Coming from the Arctic, so one of the coldest regions in the world, to perhaps one of the hotter regions in the world, for me makes this conversation very interesting. Now, speaking in these 2 weeks of the Berlin Climate Security Conference, for me, one thing that I reflected on this morning, in fact, so 1st of October in South Africa, we have already started torrential rains. I'm starting there because sometimes a lot of the conversations we have are almost, from a bird's eye view and not always really looking at the everyday realities. Why do I raise this? Because torrential rains at the end of September, early October in Southern Africa is rare. In fact, the kinds of rains that we've had in this week and that we'll continue to have as projected by the Weather Service are rains that we normally expect nearer to the end of November. That has an impact on, particularly in Southern Africa, which is a largely agrarian region. It has an impact on questions of food security, water security, and also just generally questions of livelihoods. Southern Africa happens to be one of the largest regions on the African continent. It amounts for 30% of the land mass of Africa. It's also the region that has quite a lot in terms of variety when it comes to climate. And that has to do with the fact that it includes, in its 16 countries, it includes the island nations of Mauritius, the Comoros, the Seychelles, and Madagascar, while also including, for example, countries that straddle the Kalahari Desert, such as Botswana. At the same time, we have countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, and Zambia that have fairly temperate climates, but that range from very arid to semi-arid. Now, that means whatever, and we're going to go into this in a moment, but whatever solutions are shaped in Southern Africa really have to be more context specific. What works for Namibia may not work for Madagascar, and what works definitely for the Comoros will unlikely work for Zimbabwe. But the reality is it also happens to be one of the more populous regions on the continent. With over 363 million people, it's pretty much just over a quarter of the continent's population, and also the region with some of the greatest inequality, while also having some of the more gains when it comes to democratic consolidation. So that opens a door, perhaps, for spaces of engagement, while recognizing that this is the region when cyclones are reported in the African continent. This is the region hardest hit, whether it's in Malawi, Zimbabwe, or Mozambique. It's also the region that has had great water scarcity, even in coastal areas like Cape Town in South Africa.
Thank you so much for the three of you for all these insights that are really interesting for us to hear. We can see that all the regions, they're very different from one another, but what unites them is that climate change compounds other fragility risks, pre-existing ones, to multiply the risk landscape of the region. So let's dive a bit deeper into your specific regions now. Otilia, let's start with you and the Southern African region you were speaking right now. So spoiler alert, because we will launch the brief soon. In your risk brief, which is about to be published soon, you identified 3 pathways through which climate change impacts stability in the region. I think you got into this a little bit, but perhaps you could explain to our audience what they're about a little bit more in detail.
Sorry, Hannah, I'm coughing. if
Should we maybe move to, yeah, that's a good idea.
Absolutely, of
you
course.
can go and get another
glass
of water.
You
can just go, yeah.
Let me just move to Marisol.
I hate when that happens, when you get like a dry throat and you're like, oh my God.
I'm fine.
Yeah, would you like to go? Would you like to wait?
Yes, please. Sorry about that. For some bizarre reason, my throat is a bit scratchy today. So
the perks of being live.
In the risk group, we identify 3 pathways. First is that climate-induced disasters can trigger forced migration due to food as well as livelihood insecurity. I spoke earlier about the fact that the Southern African region, for the most part, is an agrarian region. And a lot of communities rely on farming, particularly subsistence farming in the rural communities. But it's not just about the smaller communities that rely on this, it's also one of the main industries for a lot of Southern African countries. As a result, people where they're unable to continue to sustain their livelihoods through agriculture are often forced out of their homes. Now, we see a lot of this movement coming from rural areas towards urban areas, so forcing greater urbanization or faster pace of urbanization in some countries such as South Africa, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Zambia as examples. The second fragility pathway that we identified is that climate-induced disasters reduce biodiversity as well as destroying infrastructure. And this, again, threatens livelihoods and increases vulnerabilities, particularly in very unequal spaces and societies. And this can compound or fuel social unrest and instability. And unfortunately, in some areas, we see this also encouraging violent extremist groups. Now, earlier this year, in February, for example, we saw, again, torrential rains within South Africa that have cost the country billions in rand and billions also in dollars in terms of need to rebuild areas that were affected. We've also seen the devastating impact in countries like Mozambique and Zimbabwe following series of cyclones in these two countries. Now, these are countries that are trying to develop, at the same time having to deal with the devastation of climate on their infrastructure and their development. And we see, like I said, social unrest, particularly as it relates to service delivery, for example, erupting across the region. And most notably, when it comes to questions of violent extremism, we see the instrumentalization of lack of access to basic goods being used by terror groups in the north of Mozambique. The final pathway that we identified is the rise in sea levels. This affects not only coastal communities, but as I mentioned, Southern Africa is the region with the most in terms of island nations in Southern Africa. So places like the Comoros and the Seychelles are gravely impacted by the rise in sea levels, and this affects communities and reduces their opportunities for economic growth. Again, sorry that I had a scratchy throat earlier, but I hope we're back on track.
We certainly are. One of the pathways that you mentioned has to do with violence and unrest in the region. And I think we've heard a lot about unrest in the region quite a bit lately, particularly in South Africa, in Eswatini, for example, that we're experiencing protests and violence in the past few months. Would you say that there's an element here of an influence of the climate-related insecurity?
It's difficult to just make a sort of a direct link, because I think there's a confluence of issues affecting society. And sometimes there then is almost a connection between people's frustrations with lack of access to basic goods and resources, the increase, for example, in food prices as a result of the rains again, but also cycles of dry spells that impact, for example, our wheat production or horticulture. So while we cannot make a simple and direct link between, for example, some of the climate stressors or climate events that we're seeing in South Africa, in Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, and Malawi, for example, we can be able to say that as a result of limited access to what would otherwise be cheaper or basic goods, we see increased frustrations among the society. What would be, and I know I may be jumping into the next conversation here, but what would be my recommendation is limit as much as possible the influence of certain events, whether it's climate events, so that they don't contribute to this basket of concerns of societies already affected by inequality, poverty, and increasing crime and violence.
Thank you. That's a great segue for the question that I wanted to ask you next. Of course, now that we know what the risk landscape is, what would be entry points? So is there something that can be done to handle and reduce these risks that you just talked about?
There's quite a number of entry points, and I really want people to read the risk brief. Again, minding that Southern Africa is a region of 16 countries, so it can be very difficult to distill and simplify. So what I would say, and this is minding that we're having a conversation about local solutions, but perhaps given that a lot of the Southern African countries are affected by climate stressors, both sudden, but also a lot of slow onset ones. This is perhaps, for me, one of the first and important entry points is take a step back, think regionally. What lessons, for example, can Mozambique learn from neighboring Zimbabwe or Malawi? And already through the Southern African Development Community, at least on paper and at least in policies, they have the measures in place. Southern Africa happens to be one of the few regions that has an existing early warning mechanism through the National Weather Services that allows at least for regions to be warned. But the next stage is about preparedness. It's not enough to be told that there could be a cyclone that affects a particular region. There has to be more in terms of technical support to ensure preparedness. So one of the other entry points is really to reinforce existing strategies beyond just having them in place, but ensuring that there are practical elements to them at national as well as regional level. Now, the next, and I'm going to stop here because there's a lot of entry points and I really want people to read the brief. The next is learn from local communities. Now, what better community than communities that have had to confront these climate impacts pretty much for their whole life? I come from both South Africa and Zimbabwe, where for years we've had to deal with cycles of drought, but also of torrential rains. In some communities, questions around rain harvesting, for example, are part of the way that they know how to ensure that if you don't have running water, at the very least, you harvest the rain that comes from the sky. But also recognizing that we are a region that has a lot of sunlight. I mentioned earlier, coming from the Arctic to Southern Africa, we can be able to make use of those things that we already do have, but also encouraging societies to be able to have other livelihood options beyond depending primarily on agriculture. And maybe by starting there, but also by listening, I would say, to communities on how they are affected and impacted by climate change, can we be able to shape solutions that won't just be short-term knee-jerk solutions, but actually that have a longer-term impact, particularly in the poorer communities, of which, unfortunately, for Southern Africa, make up the majority.
Thank you so much, Ottilia. That was really, really interesting, and I'm already looking forward to the brief to be released. And we will move to the Arctic now. We already said contrasts couldn't be starker in some dimensions, but what climate fragility pathways have you identified that come into play in the Arctic region, Marisol?
Okay, great. So I do want to note before I mention the Arctic pathways that there are several things that Ottilia just said that very much resonate, but we'll get into that at the end, where I think there's a lot of similarities actually in how we need to address this for the Arctic as well. Okay, so in terms of Arctic climate fragility pathways, I mentioned the term actorless threats earlier, and I think that that's something that I really want to kind of drive home as the way that we need to conceptualize the increasing influence of things like climate change, biodiversity loss, pandemics, and the way that they're increasingly shaping the threat environment, and increasingly influencing security and stability. And that the threats that emanate from them are physical, but also geopolitical. In the United States, for instance, we've seen 700,000 Americans almost that have died from COVID. And if there was an actor behind that kind of mortality event, we would be responding very differently. And so my point is that we're increasingly going to be dealing with threats that lack that proximate actor to blame. And that has implications for security and intelligence communities, as well as the policy community. So these actorless threats pose risks in the ways that states and individuals respond to the challenges. And so there's there's the actorless threats pose the threats within their immediate impacts, but then also the ways that states and non-state actors respond create their own subset of challenges. And so, for instance, if one wealthy individual takes it upon themselves to deploy a geoengineering technology, some of these technologies are not super expensive and can be fairly accessible. And so that is definitely an emerging threat, especially if there's the perception that governments are not taking sufficient action on climate change. So there's many unknowns when it comes to the ways that the Arctic may be involved in future migration issues, but I would highlight in advance the risk of xenophobia getting in the way of productive opportunities. So safe and sanctioned migration to the Arctic could actually be a key to unlocking the workforce to help to develop new opportunities that are evolving in the region, but communities will be more averse to potentially people coming from other places if they're being framed as a threat. And so that's where I think that the policy community also has an obligation to get in front of that framing with language and not be talking about it as a risk of migration, but rather what are the opportunities. So some specifics, Russia is experiencing climate change in some places 5 times faster than the global average rate. And so the northern sea route along their northern coast is becoming increasingly accessible for longer periods of time. And the Arctic is very important to their economy, and it will be even more so. They're really trying to minimize stranded assets related to oil, coal, natural gas. And then there's also new opportunities with minerals and other resources. But so we're seeing them, remilitarizing their Cold War bases, testing increasingly advanced weapon systems. And so after 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, there's obviously more tension around Russian aggression and their intent. And it's really not useful to try to parse offensive from defensive capabilities. And so the US and our allies and partners in the region and beyond, including like the UK, have increased our own exercising in the Arctic to be able to increase our operational capability. And we need to be doing that in terms of, building that capability because it's also a deterrent. But there is then enhanced risk of miscalculation or misinterpretation that could cause conflict. We've seen that after 2014, with some of the sanctions that prevented military to military cooperation, the 2 forums that dealt with hard security issues in the Arctic, which is the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable and the Arctic Chiefs of Defense, no longer included Russia. And so there's a real a gap there in terms of our ability to communicate and reduce risk. And then over to China, through soft power diplomacy, scientific research, and financial investment, China really is expanding their efforts to gain access, presence, and influence in the Arctic region. And then there's also some military interests that Russia has, which I can get into a little bit later. And then also, as there's new opportunities for the licit economy in the Arctic, there are opportunities for the illicit economy. And if you look at the impact of transnational criminal groups around the world, they are absolutely immense and they are opportunistic. It's not like the previous hierarchical kind of mob style groups. Like these are extremely adaptive, lacking that bureaucracy. So they're able to see a new opportunity and exploit it. And so the Arctic policy community needs to be very aware of the ways that good opportunities could be exploited by bad actors.
Thanks so much. Before, you also said that the fate of the Arctic is the fate of Miami. And so if I understand it correctly, then climate change in the Arctic triggers more negative effects in other regions. Do you have any examples how the climate change effects in the Arctic trigger other pathways of climate fragility around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's already an established connection between Greenland's ice sheet melts with a drastic decrease in West African monsoon precipitation. And that's especially important for a region like the Sahel with all of the challenges that are already going on there. Then there's also, there was a study that came out this year that was looking at this major snowfall event in Europe in 2018. It was referred to as the beast from the east. And they found that 88% of the snow that fell in Europe was actually specifically linked to long-term ice decline in the Arctic Ocean, and particularly in the Barents Sea. And then also in terms of permafrost, 80% of Alaska is underlaid by permafrost, 60% of Russia. So there's very significant concerns about the implications, not just for those places, but also for the contributions to greenhouse gases. So permafrost releases not just carbon dioxide, but also methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. And it can also be a source of novel pathogens, such as like viruses and bacteria, fungi. And we've also seen places where we're having very large releases of things like radon, which is the second leading cause of lung cancer, and as well as very high concentrations of mercury. And I actually want to flag, there was a study that came out in Nature, the journal Nature, yesterday, that is Dr. Kimberly Miner had led some research that was looking at biological, chemical, and radioactive materials that have been sequestered in the cryosphere, so like the frozen parts of the world, that are at risk of being released due to thaw. So I would highly recommend checking that out, because it's really serious, the implications of permafrost thaw and what could be released into the environment.
Thank you so much for highlighting this. Now, looking into the future, we already talked about the fact that there are immense consequences to the international security and stability, and also to health, as you just mentioned. And in your risk brief, you also identify manifold entry points, how governments and policymakers could best address the compound climate fragility risks. Could you please name the most important ones and explain them?
Yeah, so this is where I want to tie back in with what Otilia was saying, because just like she was saying that with Southern Africa, it's not a one size fits all kind of situation, because there's so many countries involved. And it's the same thing with the Arctic, where the Arctic is, yes, it's a region that we kind of generally define as, above 66 degrees north, but it's very diverse. And the European Arctic is very different from the North American Arctic. So it's really important to just like Otilia was saying, to look to communities for place-based solutions. And so, one of the really important pieces of that for the Arctic is looking to integrate traditional knowledge systems into the policy process, but from the very beginning. So working, in a very ethical way, and even deciding like what are the problems that we are defining, and then how should we go about addressing them, and recognizing that traditional knowledge systems are fully intact, valid knowledge systems that are complementary to Western science, but do not need to be validated by Western science, and that they should be used in concert. Relating to some of the harder security issues, General Milley actually just recently met with Russian General Gerasimov, and they both expressed interest in renewing some kind of dialogue for risk reduction and deconflicting operations. So that's a really positive step that I've seen. And then just conceptually, something like One Health which is the CDC has advocated for this. They have a center at the University of Alaska, and that recognizes the inherent interconnectivity of human, animal, and environmental health. And so it's not about thinking about them in silos, but understanding that these are complex dynamics that influence each other. And you can't think about human health as being somehow separate from the natural world. And then in terms of another kind of local solution, strengthening the circular economy would be a really positive step from the policy community. So when it comes to electronic waste, being able to harvest minerals, to upcycle those. Yes, the Arctic has a lot of minerals, but it's still an extractive process. It's not super clean. So if we can limit how much we're doing that, it's important. And ideally, we really do also need to be addressing consumption. I know nobody wants to hear that, but it's realistic. And then also even with circular economy, with something like plastic production, which has a huge carbon footprint and is just tremendously polluting for the environment. So there's, for instance, a Danish company called Plastics, like with an X at the end, and they take material like ghost gear, like fishing nets that had been discarded, and they recover those, and then they actually turn it into a raw material to be repurposed into other new products. So helping to really take that full spectrum approach towards risk reduction.
Thank you, Marisol. And now very, very quickly, just at the end, because you already touched upon it, and I think it's like an important dimension that also makes the Arctic very special. Regarding geopolitical aspects, what do countries engaged in the region want to achieve, and how do you see China's presence in the region developing? And do also general geopolitical tensions between China and the US factor into this?
Yeah, so I mean, generally the countries in the region, so the Arctic countries want to be able to realize new opportunities, and really they need to be then, reducing risk associated with greater presence and more activity in the region so that they can realize those potentials. Because if we have a huge oil spill in the Arctic, for instance, that could be very serious for the blue bioeconomy, which is really important for a lot of Arctic countries' economies. And then, when it comes to China, I really don't think of it as like a US-China tension. We're seeing the CCP becoming increasingly autocratic, really, disregarding human rights, including the rights of their own people. And then also this really extensive military civil fusion, which really obfuscates their intent in the region. And so that's really what makes their interest in the Arctic concerning. So they have observer status right now, but I would argue that they're seeking to build their equities in the region so that that can later be leveraged for an argument that they should have a larger role in the region. And it's not, because it's China that's problematic. It's because the way the CCP, what it looks like as China gains power is not something that is, conducive to human rights and to democracy. And so that's very concerning. And then also, even with, Arctic research, which we desperately need to be cooperating on climate science in the Arctic to understand, these changes that are occurring. But we know that, again, with the civil military fusion, the research that China engages in is dual purpose. And we also know there was a Russian naval officer who had been retired, but he was arrested for treason. And he had provided to the CCP information about how Russia detects submarines. So that, to me, like when you look at where their icebreaker goes, Rob Hubert is a Canadian researcher, and he had been kind of tracing Shui Long's route, and Shui Long is one of their icebreakers, and saying, wow, like, some of the places that they're going would be good for hiding a submarine. And that is something that China is very interested in for a sea-based nuclear deterrent, and that second strike capability. So that's also very concerning.
Thank you so much. We've heard so many interesting things already. But let's move back to the African continent for a second and speak about the Horn of Africa. So Sagal, we know that climate change pressures, they are already interacting with conflict dynamics in the Horn of Africa region. So which climate fragility risks should policymakers in the region be aware of?
So thanks. It's been so wonderful listening to Marisol and Natalia. So I've learned so much. Okay, so conflict dynamics in the Horn. There's a lot to say about that, and there isn't time to go into all of it. But let me start with sort of we have conflict in the region, conflict with a big C. We've got wars between countries, which are pretty rare, but usually kicked off by border disputes. Interstate conflicts or civil wars are much more common, and Somalia is the most obvious example, with a civil war that's led to extended state collapse. And we've got even civil wars that lead to entirely new countries, Eritrea and South Sudan, and possibly Somaliland. So the first climate fragility risk that I'd like to mention is that the region itself is already politically volatile. And conflict and the constant sort of responding to conflict has further weakened the capacity of the people and the institutions to respond to extreme weather events and to do the work of adaptation to climate change. In the Horn, we also have conflict, they call it conflict with the little c. And these are sort of these communal resource-based conflicts over pasture lands, over water points, livestock, land ownership. Hyperlocal, low-intensity conflicts, possibly among pastoralists or between pastoralists and farmers. And these types of conflicts have been around for a very long time, and communities have developed quite sophisticated traditional conflict resolution mechanisms to deal with them. All the studies on the linkages between climate change and conflict in the Horn are focused on this level of conflict. And climate change is definitely putting pressure on these already limited resources, as is rapid population growth, rapid urbanization, and changing land use systems. So the droughts and floods and other shocks devastate livelihoods, and this can lead either to people being more drawn or more susceptible to being recruited into criminal or radical groups, or also to people moving to seek opportunities elsewhere, raising the possibility of coming into conflict with other communities. So I'd say that the second climate fragility risk is the high level of vulnerability to this kind of livelihood shock. 80% of the population, again, as I've mentioned, is dependent on farming and livestock, and all are dependent on the increasingly unpredictable rains. And there are very few safety nets. The traditional conflict resolution mechanisms are also under immense strain. One, by the sheer number of people being displaced by climate pressures and or conflict. And two, because people are moving further for resources, so beyond the traditional negotiated corridors. And here I'm talking about the pastoralists whose nomadic way of life is already an adaptation to the very harsh and arid terrain. So this is the third climate fragility risk, I think. The natural capacity for conflict resolution of the little c communal conflicts is being eroded. And it's coming at a time where climate change is increasing the likelihood of resource conflict. And even worse, I think, in this region's sort of broader political landscape of identity politics and a lot of shaky political transitions that are happening. In some cases, these low-level conflicts can end up being instrumentalized by political actors and escalating dramatically, which can, for example, turn into the border disputes that end up leading to sort of conflict with the big C. And then finally, I want to bring up sort of a fourth risk that we need to be aware of. The Horn is also vulnerable to the political and economic responses to climate change from other parts of the world. So the examples here include Gulf state investments in bread baskets in Ethiopia and Sudan, driven by concerns for their own food security, or international climate offsetting schemes that acquire large forests in different parts of the region. And this can lead to conflicts with local communities who themselves rely on access to this land and to the forest for their own livelihoods. So those are the sort of four climate fragility risks that I wanted to talk about.
Thanks a lot. And now that we have this background on the risks in the region, let's take a look at perhaps external influences, because we have European actors, for example, who are approaching climate security risks in the Horn of Africa through a wide range of interventions and projects, which are already underway across the region. How would you say that cooperation between different actors and policies could be encouraged and done correctly?
Sure. So the brief that I had prepared was looking specifically at this topic and whether sort of EU interventions and the responses in the Horn could be helpful in this point. And I think the main point is that the EU is supporting local efforts at multiple different levels. The biggest effort and greatest focus, of course, lies with the Horn of Africa governments, who need to and who are doing their best to put the focus on protecting the vulnerable populations and making sure that the hardships and grievances exacerbated by the changing climate do not turn into security issues in the first place. And of course, the cooperation there, the governments are not going to do it on their own, so there needs to be cooperation between government actors, not-for-profit organizations, multilateral actors as well. Related to this are efforts to improve natural resource management and to strengthen, of course, the dispute resolution mechanisms that I said are under strain that will ultimately help to lessen any violent competition for resources. I think this is especially important in areas where displaced communities are drawn to resource-rich areas, which of course makes sense, leading to tensions with the people who are already there. I think governments need to also look holistically within their own policies and priorities. To my point earlier, of course, it's important to attract foreign investments. So for example, Gulf investments in major agricultural projects, but this has to be balanced against the needs of the population and thinking about sort of internal food security. So a level of sort of prioritization within government policies. On the regional level, there's a lot of cooperation that happens, and IGAD, the regional body, does a lot of this work. And I'll give two examples. One is IGAD's developed and the Horn of Africa governments have endorsed protocols on free movement of people and livestock across the national borders within the region, which allows for local authorities at the border regions to collaborate and cooperate as pastoralists and farmers move, looking in search for water. And this is critical because these pastoralist groups are often at the center of the region's communal conflicts, and protecting their mobility can, of course, strengthen their resilience. The second example is developing an early warning mechanism. And I know Tilia mentioned that in the context of Southern Africa. There is one in the region, again, focused on identifying and de-escalating cross-border conflict pressures. These border regions are sort of flashpoints, getting local authorities to diffuse these communal resource conflicts before they get escalated. We do have a regional body called ICPAC that is looking specifically at climate, and there is now collaboration between the early warning mechanism and this climate body. So the data is being fed into the conflict analysis, which I think is another great example of cooperation.
Very interesting. Would you say that these challenges that climate change poses to the region, but also to the world at large, that they could represent an opportunity for cooperation, dialogue, also mediation and peace building for the Horn of Africa?
I think yes. The very short answer is definitely yes. And I think not just for me, I think this is why we're all doing this work on some level. The slightly longer answer is yes and. So yes, I think there's an opportunity. I think the urgency that's facing us now to avert these potential disasters and to adapt to new climate realities can present a new entry point into sort of old stuck problems that we've been working on for a long time. And I think that there is definitely an opportunity to shift from a zero-sum mindset towards collaboration. My yes and comes in, I think, yes, and we have to keep the focus on peace building instead of securitization. This region tends to securitize issues that at the core are not security issues. So we securitize radicalization, which is really about the lack of opportunities for young people and communities. We've managed to securitize migration, which itself is as a coping mechanism, a positive coping mechanism for a response to conflict and extreme weather events. Another yes and is, and I don't want to underestimate this, is development. I think development is important, and underlying a lot of these problems is the need for development. There are actual concrete solutions that are possible to some of the problems in the Horn. Better infrastructure, better water management, actual healthcare, education. Some of these problems have answers and they need investment and execution. So yes, while I support, and I think we all should continue to support dialogue, mediation, peace building, but let's also not lose sight of the importance of raising the general standard of living. We don't want a situation where communities are going to be mediating for the next decades over less and less and less water. We need to make the investments, the development investments that are needed as well. So that's my answer.
Thank you three so much. I have a feeling we could go on for ages, and it's so interesting also to see what actually are similarities and what are differences and where can we learn from all those challenges. But let's open the discussion for the chat, because I've been keeping an eye on the chat and there were a few interesting questions coming in. So the first one was for Utilia. From Kelechi, how do you see the current external influences posed by China's presence in the Southern African region regarding resource use and extraction, and also with reference to opportunities from forming a joint Southern African regional action on livelihoods for millions of people living in the region? No, you're still struggling with your thought. Is it fine?
Yeah. I'm just going to struggle with this for
so sorry.
the whole of the day. So I'll speak until I can't.
Thank you.
Kelechi, thank you so much for your question. I'll start perhaps at the easier part of your question, which relates to opportunities around forming a Southern African regional action that looks at questions of livelihoods. Right. As I mentioned, SADC, at the very least, on paper, has got things right or mostly right. Now, the challenge that we have, and this is part of some of the entry points and recommendations that are made in the forthcoming risk brief, is in fact around coordination that's not just state-centered. So a lot of the recommendations that we've seen, for example, look at SADC as the institution that must encourage regional partnerships, for example, when the reality is, and this speaks to another question that has been posed by someone else around local solutions, is civil society organizations, some non-governmental actors, for example, would do better in having a greater coordination when it comes to not just the response, but actually shaping some of those solutions and looking towards livelihoods. I know, for example, the International Organization for Migration, but also the International Committee for the Red Cross, particularly in Malawi and in Mozambique, has been leading some initiatives on livelihoods in particular and looking towards essentially cross-border engagement where it is possible. Because, and I always say this and stress this as much as possible, the weather or climate doesn't really care for borders. And so we need to also likewise be able to collaborate across those borders when we can. Now, the first part of your question around China, and really this is a question about extractive industries and perhaps the influence of China in respect not only of in the mining sector, but also of the use perhaps of coal, particularly in some of the industries in Southern Africa and in their push for infrastructural development. Now, Sagal alluded to this a little bit earlier on her yes and development, because we've also got to recognize that this is a region that needs infrastructural development. And unfortunately, there is going to be reliance on fossil fuels in order to do that. And China, at least to date, has not really been the champion against fossil fuels until fairly recently, after the IPCC report and announcements, at least from the government, around reduction of their own reliance, which hopefully will not just be within China, but an externalization of that reduction, right? And so what I would say as a final note is, yes, let's look at China's involvement and engagement in the Southern African region, but the extractive industries in the region are not just China and national governments. And in fact, we're seeing increasingly a lot of Western also governments and businesses rather operating. And the final note is, please look at Mozambique, particularly looking at the LNG gas at the moment, and how that is intrinsically linked with the conflict and the tensions in northern Mozambique. So economic opportunity on the one hand, but because it's not benefiting the local communities, instrumentalization and the result of extremist violence within that region as well.
Thanks so much, Ottilia. And what I will do is, there was one general question. I will take the general question and play it over to Marisol, because there was one specific question for Zagal, which we will turn to afterwards, and then we will wrap it up. So Marisol, when you speak to local communities, what are the three main things they ask for to strengthen their responses to climate change shocks, and what local responses can be scaled up? Personally, I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, so again, I would say, the Arctic is not homogenous. So really it depends on who you're talking to. So thankfully, the Arctic Council is, the premier intergovernmental body for the region, and it's consensus based. And it's actually like the most progressive kind of body that I've even seen, because they have the 8 Arctic states, but they also have observers, which you can apply for observer status if you reach certain criteria, like demonstrating interest and commitment and to the region, and also respect for rule of law and the general dynamics that guide it. But then there's also permanent participants, which are, some of these indigenous groups, NGOs, and so they have working groups that exist under the Arctic Council that will work on specific issues that are important for communities. So it might be something like, even solid waste management, or looking at marine litter, because the Arctic tends to accumulate a lot of plastic pollution from other parts of the world. And so when it comes to what is most important to communities, that really varies depending on who you're talking to. An interesting example that we recently saw was with the election in Greenland. And when there was a mine that was a mining operation that was planning to go ahead, but it was actually is near a uranium deposit. And this was an Australian company, but it had a 10% Chinese state affiliated stake. And after this election was really about, like, we will have mining on our terms. We're not going to be having mining that is going to impact our food security, because they're concerned about the uranium and the way that could impact their subsistence practices with hunting and fishing. And so that really showed, Greenland is open to mining, but on their terms and in a way that's not just extractive, but will actually benefit the people of Greenland, which is a largely indigenous country, or it's a part of Denmark, but they're working towards being fully sovereign. So it's an interesting dynamic there.
Thank you. And now over to you, Sagal. Maybe you can also touch upon the question I asked before, because it's so interesting to see also the differences between the regions. But then there was another question from Hadi Tabara to Sagal, especially. It is argued that conflicts in the Horn of Africa are directly related to climate change. Do you agree? And is there a historic account of these agro-pastoralist conflicts to compare and correlate with climate change?
This is why I differentiated between conflict with a big C and conflict with a little c. You know, I think that I do not think that we can say that the wars of the Horn of Africa are directly related to climate change. I think that there are other reasons, political, identity politics, nation states. There's other reasons. I think that the fact that a lot of times these conflicts can lead to famine or access to food is used as part of the war is a feature of the sort of the landscape and the fact that there is this tremendous, you know, that the Horn, a large part of the Horn is incredibly poor and people are incredibly vulnerable. But I do not think that we can say that the large scale conflicts are directly related to climate change. I think that on the lower little c communal type conflicts, they're very much related to natural resources. And I think that that's really where they come from. But I want to say those were there before climate change. Is there a time before climate change? I don't know. But like there's always been some sort of resource conflicts. Climate change is definitely putting pressure on those and making those more likely to occur. In terms of a historic account of these agro-pastoralist conflicts, I think there's a very interesting study that was done by CIPRI on pathways, and they specifically looked at this region, and they specifically looked at like a very wide range of studies looking at the impact of climate change. So I'm happy to get you that study, the name of it, and it's, if you look at the brief that I wrote, it's actually quoted quite extensively. Where they do actually look at it. And again, they find that there are the 3 specific pathways at that level of conflict. So I hope that answers it. I'll give you another interesting example. I think that, you know, a lot of people talk today about the Nile and the negotiations around the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia as like, you know, here's a climate change conflict and it's the Nile and it's the river. And actually, again, I would be careful with that because I think that riparian negotiations have always been incredibly delicate and incredibly difficult. I think there's some going on today on the border of India and China, and another one, you know, China, India, I think it's China and Pakistan or China. Anyway, the Nile goes through 11 countries, but basically this dam is going to affect the water going to Sudan and Egypt. And it's specifically for Egypt going to present this existential dilemma. I don't think climate change caused the issue. I definitely think climate change is making the negotiations much, much, much more difficult and much more fraught and harder to predict what the water levels will be in the future. And so harder to come to any kind of an agreement. So let me stop there about the conflicts of the Horn of Africa.
At this point, it's very easy to go on because the discussion is very interesting. And I just wanted to say a big thank you to our 3 guests and also to our engaging audience for asking very good questions. We have come to an end now. Unfortunately, I must say time has passed particularly fast in this session. So this was the first live recording of the Climate Diplomacy podcast. We have thoroughly enjoyed sharing this experience with all of you. Make sure to follow the Climate Diplomacy platform to know when it will be available online, and also all of these resources and other resources, also external resources that are relevant to our work, are published in our information platform. We will be back with another episode of the Climate Diplomacy podcast in a few weeks, as we always do. And as usual, you can reach us with questions, also afterwards, engaging with us in our Climate Diplo Twitter channel. And yeah, thank you for tuning in.